Sarah thought she knew her husband of 12 years better than anyone else in the world. She was wrong. Dead wrong. It started with the small things that most wives would dismiss as normal changes. David began working late more frequently. His phone suddenly had a password she didn't know, and those spontaneous weekend trips with his college buddies became monthly occurrences. Sarah pushed down the nagging feeling in her stomach, choosing to trust the man she'd built a life with, the father of her two beautiful children. But trust has a way of crumbling when the foundation it's built on is made of lies. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah was doing laundry when she found a receipt in David's jeans pocket from an expensive restaurant downtown. The date showed he'd been there the previous Friday night, the same night he claimed he was working on a big presentation until midnight. The receipt was for 2 people, and the wine they'd ordered cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. Her hands trembled as she stared at the small piece of paper that seemed to burn her fingertips. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a business dinner he forgot to mention. Maybe he was planning something special for their anniversary. Maybe. Sarah clung to these maybes like a drowning woman clutches driftwood. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself doing something she never thought she'd do. She started paying attention, really paying attention, to her husband's patterns. She noticed how he showered immediately after coming home from work, how he kept his phone face down during dinner, how he seemed distracted even during their conversations about mundane things like the kids' school activities or weekend plans. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in April. David announced he had another weekend trip planned with his college friend Marcus. Sarah smiled and nodded, just as she had dozens of times before, but this time something inside her snapped. After David left for work the next morning, she did something that would change everything. She called Marcus. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes shattered Sarah's world into a million irreparable pieces. Marcus was confused about the call, mentioning that he hadn't seen David in months and certainly hadn't planned any weekend trips with him. In fact, Marcus was surprised to hear from Sarah at all, since David had told him that they were having marital problems and weren't speaking to mutual friends. Sarah hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the normal sounds of her normal life. The dishwasher hummed, the clock ticked, her neighbor's dog barked in the distance. But nothing was normal anymore. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her husband, was built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. That's when Sarah made a decision that would expose the truth in the most devastating way possible. Instead of confronting David immediately, Sarah decided to follow him. She arranged for her mother to watch the kids and told her she had a work emergency that would keep her out for the weekend. Friday evening, as David packed his overnight bag and kissed her goodbye with lips that had been lying to her for months, Sarah felt like she was watching a stranger perform in a play about her life. 2 hours after David left, Sarah got in her car and drove to the address she'd found in his browser history, an address he'd visited multiple times but had carefully deleted each time. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white as she navigated through unfamiliar neighborhoods, following GPS directions to a downtown apartment complex she'd never seen before. What Sarah discovered that night was worse than her worst fears. Through the window of a ground-floor apartment, she saw her husband of 12 years sharing dinner and intimate conversation with a woman Sarah had never met. A woman who was clearly not a business colleague or a casual friend. The way David touched this woman's hand across the dinner table, the way he looked at her with an expression Sarah hadn't seen directed at herself in years, told a story that needed no explanation. Sarah sat in her car in that parking lot for 3 hours, watching her marriage die through a stranger's window. She watched David help this woman clear the dinner dishes. She watched them dance slowly to music she couldn't hear in a living room decorated with photos that included her husband's face. She watched David kiss this woman with a passion that made Sarah realize how long it had been since he'd kissed her that way. But Sarah didn't just watch. She recorded everything. The video Sarah captured that night was 12 minutes and 37 seconds of pure, undeniable evidence. Every tender gesture, every intimate moment, every proof of betrayal was documented in high-definition clarity. But Sarah wasn't done gathering evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, she followed David 3 more times, each visit to the apartment complex adding to her growing collection of video proof. What Sarah learned during those 2 weeks of secret surveillance was that David's affair wasn't a recent mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a full-blown relationship that had been going on for over 8 months. The woman's name was Jennifer. She was a marketing executive at a competing firm, and she clearly believed she was in a serious relationship with a man who had told her his marriage was essentially over. Sarah discovered through careful online research that Jennifer had even met some of David's work colleagues at office parties, introduced as his girlfriend. David had been living a complete double life, maintaining his family responsibilities while building an entirely separate existence with another woman who had no idea she was participating in an affair. The final piece of Sarah's plan fell into place on a Friday night in May. David announced another weekend trip, this time claiming he was going to a work conference in the neighboring state. Sarah knew exactly where he was really going, and more importantly, she knew exactly what she was going to do about it. Saturday morning, Sarah sent David a text message asking him to call her when he had a moment to talk. When her phone rang an hour later, Sarah was sitting in her living room with her laptop open, the 12-minute video queued up and ready to play. David's voice was cheerful and unsuspecting as he explained that the conference was going well and that he'd probably be back Sunday evening instead of Monday morning. Sarah listened to him lie with the same casual ease he'd been using for months, and she realized that this man was a complete stranger to her. Then Sarah said the words that would end their marriage and change both their lives forever. She told David to check his email immediately and call her back after he'd watched the video she'd just sent. She could hear the confusion in his voice, then the growing alarm as he asked what video she was talking about. Sarah's voice was steady and calm as she explained that she knew about Jennifer, she knew about the apartment, she knew about the 8 months of lies, and she had video evidence of everything. The silence that followed lasted almost 30 seconds. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, asking how long she'd known. Sarah told him she'd known for 2 weeks, but she'd suspected for much longer. She told him she'd seen enough to know that their marriage was over, but she wanted him to see exactly what she'd seen before they talked about what came next. 20 minutes later, David called back. This time, there were no lies, no explanations, no excuses. Just the sound of a man who knew he'd been caught and whose carefully constructed double life had just collapsed completely. Sarah listened as David cried, as he begged for forgiveness, as he promised to end things with Jennifer immediately. But Sarah had made her decision during those long hours sitting in parking lots, watching her husband love someone else. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal, and some trust, once broken, can never be repaired. The video she'd captured wasn't just evidence of David's infidelity. It was proof that the man she'd married, the father of her children, was capable of living a lie so complete and so convincing that she'd never suspected the truth. That video became the evidence that ended their 12-year marriage, divided their assets, and changed the trajectory of 2 children's lives forever. But for Sarah, it also became something else. It became proof that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, smart enough to uncover the truth, and brave enough to face a future she'd never planned for but was ready to build on her own terms.